9 Reasons why life is better when you're single. Have you ever stopped to wonder, what if the best years of your life are still ahead of you? For decades, we've been told that happiness comes from being part of a couple, that love, marriage, and lifelong companionship are the ultimate goals. But what if that's not the full story? What if, after 55, being single isn't something to fear, but something to embrace? Maybe life didn't unfold exactly as you planned. Maybe you've been through divorce, the loss of a spouse, or simply chose a path of independence. At first, the idea of facing this chapter alone may have felt overwhelming. After all, society places so much weight on relationships, making us believe that solitude equals loneliness. But here's the truth. This stage of life holds more freedom, peace, and joy than you've ever imagined. No more compromises, no more emotional stress, just you, rediscovering your passions, your peace, and your true self. Today, I'll reveal 9 powerful reasons why life after 55 is actually better when you're single. If you're ready to see the beauty in this new beginning, stay with me. And before we dive in, be sure to subscribe and share this message, because everyone deserves to hear it. 1. The freedom to live life on your own terms. The great philosopher Lao Tzu, founder of Taoism, once said, "When I let go of what I am, I become what I might be." His words remind us that holding on to past roles, whether as a spouse, caregiver, or provider, can keep us from embracing our true selves. The ancient Stoics, too, believed in the power of self-sovereignty. Epictetus, a former slave who became one of the greatest Stoic philosophers, taught that freedom is not found in external circumstances, but in the mastery of one's own mind. He urged, "No man is free who is not master of himself." For decades, we have built our lives around others, fulfilling responsibilities, making sacrifices, and often silencing our own desires. But true freedom begins when we recognize that we alone hold the power to shape our remaining years. I was married for 42 years. That's nearly half a century of shared decisions, compromises, and carrying the weight of another person's expectations. And for a long time, I thought that was just life. You give, you adjust, you make it work. Then, suddenly, I was alone. My husband passed away on a rainy November evening, and just like that, I was no longer a wife. People asked me, "How are you holding up?" with that concerned tilt of the head. What they didn't realize was that, after the grief had settled like dust on an old bookshelf, I felt something unexpected. Relief. It wasn't because I didn't love him. I did. But for the first time in decades, I wasn't measuring my time against someone else's needs. There was no one to check in with, no one to compromise with over dinner choices, travel plans, or even how to spend a quiet Sunday afternoon. I could sit in my kitchen, drink my coffee in silence, and not feel the weight of another person's presence pressing against my thoughts. But freedom, even when longed for, can feel unfamiliar. Society tells us that happiness is found in togetherness, in being needed by someone else. And when that structure disappears, we panic. We grasp for someone new, as if being alone is a sickness that needs curing. My friends urged me to date again, to fill the void. I refused. Instead, I traveled to New Mexico, a place I had always wanted to visit but never had the time or permission. My husband had hated traveling, so I had stayed put for years. But now, I booked the flight without hesitation. I stood in the vast desert, where the sky stretched endlessly, and the silence was a kind of music. For the first time in my life, I belonged only to myself. When I came back home, I started painting, something I had abandoned decades ago because there wasn't time. I rearranged the house, throwing out furniture that no longer suited me. I began eating breakfast at the little cafe downtown, chatting with strangers, absorbing their stories, creating new connections that were mine alone. One day a neighbor asked, "Don't you get lonely?" I smiled. I spent 42 years thinking that love meant never being alone. But I've learned something. The greatest love you can have is the kind you give yourself. Being single after 55 isn't a tragedy, it's a rebirth. It's the chance to reclaim your own name, your own choices, your own dreams. Now I ask you, if you had full control over your time, your life, your happiness, what would you do? Would you go somewhere new, pick up an old passion? Change your home to reflect who you truly are? Tell me in the comments, what is the one thing you would do if you lived life entirely on your own terms? Let's talk. 2. Peace and quiet. whenever you want. The Greek philosopher Pythagoras once said, "Learn to be silent, let your quiet mind listen and absorb." The ancients understood something we often forget. True wisdom and peace come in moments of stillness. In Buddhism, silence is seen as a path to enlightenment, with teachings urging people to retreat from noise to hear their own thoughts. Even in ancient Rome, Seneca, the great Stoic thinker, warned against the distractions of a loud and chaotic life, stating, "Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul." Yet, in modern life, silence is often feared. People surround themselves with endless distractions, news, television, constant conversation, filling every quiet space with noise. But when you embrace solitude, when you step into the stillness, you find something extraordinary: clarity, freedom, and the ability to truly hear yourself. I was married for 35 years to a man who never understood the beauty of silence. He was a good man in many ways, but he was a man of noise, always talking, always filling the room with the sound of the television, the radio, or endless chatter about the day's events. At first, I thought it was charming. His energy filled our home, and I let myself believe that silence was something to be avoided. But over the years, I started to crave moments of peace. I wanted mornings where I could sit with a cup of coffee, listening to the birds instead of the morning news blasting through the kitchen. I wanted nights where I could read without the sound of someone flipping through TV channels. But in marriage, compromise is the rule. So I learned to live with the noise. Then, one day, the noise stopped. My husband passed away suddenly, and the house became silent in a way I had never known before. At first, it was unbearable. I kept the television on just to fill the space. I invited people over constantly. I thought silence meant loneliness. But over time, something changed. I started waking up early just to hear the sound of the wind through the trees. I took walks without music in my ears, just listening to the rhythm of my own footsteps. I read books in the stillness of the evening, and, for the first time in decades, I heard my own thoughts without interruption. And I realized this was the peace I had been missing all along. Society teaches us to fear silence. It tells us that a quiet house is a sad one, that being alone means being lonely. But that's a lie. Silence is not emptiness. It is space for self-reflection, creativity, and deep contentment. Now, when people ask me if I get lonely in my quiet house, I just smile. Because I know something they don't. Peace is a treasure that most people never learn to appreciate. And now, I ask you, when was the last time you truly embraced silence? Do you find peace in quiet moments, or do you still fill them with distractions? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. 3. No more emotional stress from a relationship. The Stoics, particularly Marcus Aurelius, believe that peace comes when we focus only on what we can control, our own actions and emotions. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." In relationships, people often take on the emotional burdens of others, believing it's their duty to fix, soothe, or carry their partner's struggles. But the truth is, we cannot control the emotions of another person. The ancient Buddhist teachings also warn against attachment to suffering, reminding us that you only lose what you cling to. When we let go of the need to manage others' emotions, we reclaim our own peace. I spent 38 years married to a man who carried the world on his shoulders, and, whether I liked it or not, I carried it too. It started small, encouraging him after a bad day at work, reassuring him when he doubted himself. But over the years, it became something more. I became his emotional anchor, the one who held him together when he fell apart. I managed his stress, absorbed his anger when he had nowhere else to place it, softened every sharp edge of his moods. If he had a bad day, I had a bad day. If he was in a dark place, I dimmed my own light to match his. At first, I thought that was love, that to be a good wife meant being his rock, his refuge, but in truth, I was drowning in emotions that weren't mine. Then one day I sat across from him at the kitchen table, exhausted. I had spent years twisting myself into knots trying to make him happy, trying to fix problems that weren't mine to fix, and I realized something shocking. He had never asked me to do it. I had taken on the weight of his emotions because I believed it was my duty, and in doing so I had neglected my own. When he passed away, people assumed I would be devastated. And yes, grief came, but so did something else. Relief. A strange, quiet relief that I no longer had to carry someone else's emotions. That for the first time in nearly 40 years, I could wake up and only feel my own feelings. That was when I truly learned what the Stoics meant. We are not responsible for the storms inside others. We can offer shelter, but we must never let their rain drown us. Now I choose peace. I no longer absorb the moods of others or make their burdens my own. And let me tell you, it is liberating beyond words. So I ask you, have you ever carried someone else's emotional weight? Have you sacrificed your peace for another's happiness? Tell me in the comments. 4. Financial freedom, your money, your decisions. The great Chinese philosopher Confucius once said, "He who will not economize will have to agonize." In ancient times, wealth was not just measured in gold but in freedom, the ability to make choices without constraint. The Stoic philosopher Seneca warned that when our finances are tied to others, so too is our sense of security, teaching that wealth is the slave of the wise, but the master of the fool. Money, when controlled by others, can become a tool of restriction, but when managed wisely by oneself, it becomes the key to true independence, a life where every decision is yours alone. For 40 years I handed my paycheck over to someone else. At first it was just part of being married. My husband John handled the bills, the savings, the investments. He always told me, "I'll take care of it," and I believed him. Because that's what a good wife did, right? But over time, "I'll take care of it" started to sound different. When I wanted to visit my sister in Arizona, I was told, "Not in the budget this year." When I thought about taking a painting class, he said, "That's a waste of money." When I suggested upgrading our old car, he laughed, "The car runs fine." And yet somehow there was always money for the things he wanted. A new set of golf clubs, a bigger TV, a fishing trip with his buddies. I never questioned it. I had learned not to. It wasn't until John passed away that I realized I didn't even know how much money we had. I had spent decades earning, budgeting, sacrificing, yet I had no financial freedom. It took me months to go through the accounts, to understand where our money had gone, and then, one day I looked at my bank statement and saw it. I was wealthier than I ever knew, and for the first time, that money was truly mine. So I booked that trip to Arizona. I walked into an art store and bought the finest set of paints I could find. I donated to a charity I had always admired, but had never been allowed to support. That was the day I stopped asking permission. Society tells women of my generation that money is a man's concern, that we should be grateful for what we're given, but let me tell you, there is nothing more powerful than knowing you control your own finances. Every dollar I spend now is a decision I make for me. So I ask you, have you ever felt restricted by money? Have you ever been told no, when all you wanted was to live life on your terms? Tell me in the comments. 5. A stronger connection with family and friends. The great Roman statesman Cicero once said, "Life is nothing without friendship." In ancient China, Confucius taught that to go too far is as bad as to fall short. He believed that while devotion to marriage and duty was honorable, true wisdom came from balancing personal relationships, not pouring everything into just one. The Stoics, too, valued friendships and family bonds, seeing them as life's greatest treasures. Epictetus reminded us, "Wealth consists not in having great possessions, but in having few wants." And what do we want most in our final years? Not wealth, not status, but connection. For years I was a man with two lives. On one side there was my marriage, 42 years of shared meals, shared space, shared responsibilities. My wife Linda was a good woman, but she expected my world to revolve around her. On the other side there was my family, my daughter, my son, my grandchildren, but they never got enough of me because there was always something in the way. A dinner I couldn't miss, an argument I had to smooth over, a weekend. For Linda at first I convinced myself that was normal, that marriage meant compromise, that missing birthdays and baseball games was just part of life. Then one day, my son stopped calling. At first I blamed him. Kids today, always busy. But deep down, I knew. I had been absent long before he ever pulled away. Then Linda passed away. And suddenly I was alone. At first the silence was unbearable, but in that stillness I realized something. I had spent my life maintaining a relationship while neglecting the people who would have stood by me no matter what. So I picked up the phone. The first few calls were awkward. My daughter was polite but distant. My son took a while to answer. But slowly, over time, things changed. One evening, my granddaughter invited me to her school recital. I almost said no, out of habit. But then I caught myself. I had no excuses anymore, so I went. And when I saw her little face light up as she spotted me in the audience, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Belonging. Since then, I have built a life around the people who truly matter. I play chess with my grandson on Sundays. I take my daughter out for coffee just to listen. I laugh more, I show up more, and most importantly, I am present. If I could go back, I would tell my younger self, put love where it matters most. Don't let one relationship take everything from you. So now, I ask you, have you ever let one relationship consume all your time, only to realize you neglected the people who truly cared? Tell me in the comments. 6. Rediscovering what truly makes you happy. The great Greek philosopher Aristotle once said, "Happiness depends upon ourselves." He believed that true fulfillment comes not from status or relationships but from actively engaging in what brings us joy. Lao Tzu, the father of Taoism, taught, "A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step." Yet many of us forget this as we go through life, prioritizing responsibilities over passion. The Stoics also warned against letting external circumstances dictate our happiness. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Dwell on the beauty of life. Watch the stars and see yourself running with them." The message is clear. Joy is found in doing what sets our souls on fire. I was 19 when I got married, and just like that, my life was no longer my own. Back then, marriage meant devotion to your husband, to your children, to the home you built together. So I did what was expected. I cooked the meals, raised the kids, kept the house spotless. If my husband wanted dinner at 6, it was ready at 6. If he wanted quiet, I lowered my voice. If he wanted me to stay home, I stayed, and I never once asked myself, what do I want? Decades passed and my life was full, but not with my own dreams. My husband had his career, my children had their futures, but me? I had sacrificed every piece of myself for them. Then one day, I woke up alone. My children had grown, my husband had passed, and for the first time in 60 years, I had nothing to do, no one to cook for, no one to take care of, just me. At first it terrified me. I had spent so long existing for others that I didn't know how to exist for myself. The house was too quiet, the days too long. I sat in my kitchen one morning staring at a cup of coffee, thinking, what now? Then, out of nowhere, I remembered something, a dream I had buried for years. When I was a young girl, I loved to paint. I would sit by the window with my little brushes capturing the world in soft strokes of color. But life got in the way. First school, then marriage, then children, then survival. So that morning I made a choice. I went to the store, bought a set of paints, and set up a small table by my window, and as I dipped my brush into the paint, it was like I was meeting myself again after decades of absence. That was 2 years ago. Since then, I have painted every single day. I've taken trips to art galleries, joined a local class, and even sold a few pieces. And for the first time in my life, I am doing something just for me. Society tells us that purpose comes from serving others, but let me tell you, true purpose is also found in rediscovering what makes your heart feel alive. Now, I ask you, what is something you once loved but abandoned for the sake of others? If you could reclaim it today, what would it be? Tell me in the comments. 7. Note: no more compromising on the little things. The great Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi once told a parable about a man who loved his shadow but hated his footprints. He tried to run from them, only to find they followed him wherever he went. The lesson? The smallest things can take over our lives if we let them. The Stoics, too, understood this. Epictetus wrote, "Freedom is the only worthy goal in life. It is won by disregarding things that lie beyond our control." How often do we let trivial decisions, what to eat, what to watch, how to arrange furniture, become unnecessary battles? True freedom comes when we no longer have to compromise on life's little joys. For 52 years I compromised. At first it was over small things, where we ate, what we watched on television, how the furniture was arranged in the house. My wife Margaret had strong opinions about everything, and I learned to pick my battles. She didn't like spicy food, so we never ate it. She hated westerns, so I watched them only when she was out. She insisted on floral curtains, though I always preferred plain. It's just a small thing, I told myself each time, not worth arguing over. But after a lifetime of small compromises, you start to realize something. They add up. By the time I was in my 70s, I couldn't even remember what my own preferences were. I had spent so long adjusting to someone else's likes and dislikes that I had forgotten my own. Then one day I woke up, and Margaret was gone. The house was quiet, and for the first time it was entirely mine. I walked into the kitchen and realized I could eat anything I wanted for breakfast. So I drove to the store, bought a dozen jalapenos, and made the spiciest omelet I could stand. I sat there, sweating, my mouth on fire, and I laughed. It was ridiculous, but I felt alive. Then I went to the living room, picked up the remote, and turned on an old western. I watched it all the way through without anyone telling me to change the channel. A few weeks later I took down the floral curtains and replaced them with simple, solid-colored ones, not because I hated them, but because they weren't mine. People say the little things don't matter, but let me tell you, when you finally get to choose without compromise, you realize they matter more than you ever knew. So now I ask you, what's one small thing you've always wanted to do but never could? What's a little joy you've set aside for the sake of someone else? Tell me in the comments. 8. Your home is your true sanctuary. The great Lao Tzu, founder of Taoism, taught that to the mind that is still, the whole universe surrenders. He believed that true peace comes not from the world outside, but from the space we create within. Similarly, the Stoic philosopher Seneca wrote, "Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul." But what about the physical world we inhabit? Our home is a reflection of our inner peace. It should be a place where we feel at ease, where every chair, every picture, every quiet corner speaks of comfort and belonging. When you live alone, you finally have the chance to shape that space to reflect your soul. For 47 years, I lived in a house that never quite felt like mine. Oh, I loved it, I had to. It was the home where my children grew up, where birthdays and anniversaries were celebrated, where laughter echoed in the halls, but it was never truly my space. My husband Bill had strong opinions about everything. The walls had to be neutral colors because bright ones felt too loud. The furniture had to be practical, never just for beauty. He didn't like too many framed photos on the walls, so I kept them in drawers. I never realized how much I had adjusted, how much of myself I had tucked away for the sake of compromise. Then, one day, I was alone. At first, the silence of an empty house felt unbearable. It felt too big, too still, too full of memories that had nowhere to go. But then, I started seeing it differently, not as the place I had shared with someone else, but as a blank canvas waiting for me to make it my own. One morning, I took out an old photo of my parents and placed it on the mantel. Then another of my children when they were young. And then, just because I could, I painted the living room a deep shade of blue, bold and beautiful, the color of the sea. I bought pillows with floral designs, filled the rooms with books, lit candles at night just because I liked the glow. And one day I looked around and realized, for the first time in my life, I was home. People don't talk about how much of themselves they give up when sharing a home. They don't notice it at first, the little compromises, the decorations they never chose, the colors they never loved. But when you live alone, you have the chance to reclaim that space, to make it a reflection of who you are, not just who you had to be for someone else. So I ask you, if you could change one thing about your home just for you, what would it be? A color? A piece of art? A space just for your passion? Tell me in the comments. 9. A social life that fits your needs. The Greek philosopher Epicurus once said, "Of all the things that wisdom provides to help one live one's entire life in happiness, the greatest by far is friendship." Unlike many thinkers of his time, Epicurus did not believe that wealth or power brought fulfillment. Instead, he taught that a carefully chosen circle of friends was the key to a joyful life. Similarly, the Stoic philosopher Seneca warned against social obligations that drain us, advising, "Associate only with those who improve you. If they don't, let them go." The message is clear. A fulfilling social life isn't about quantity, but about quality. When you are single, you finally have the freedom to build relationships that nourish your soul. For most of my life, my social life wasn't my own. It was built around my wife, her friends, her events, her obligations. I spent decades going to dinner parties with couples I barely liked, sitting through conversations I had no interest in, attending family gatherings where I felt like a guest in my own life. But that's marriage, isn't it? You compromise, you adjust, you make it work. Then, when my wife passed, something strange happened. The invitations stopped. The phone calls slowed. The people I had spent years entertaining, her friends, our shared social circle, simply faded away. At first it hurt. I thought, was I only valued as part of a couple? But then, after some reflection, I realized the truth. Most of those relationships weren't real. They were built on obligation, not genuine connection. So I made a choice. Instead of mourning the loss of a social life I never truly enjoyed, I decided to build a new one that fit me. I reconnected with an old friend from my college days, a man I hadn't spoken to in 30 years because my wife never liked him. We meet for coffee every Sunday now. I joined a local history club because I've always loved the past, but never had time to indulge in it. I started attending a men's group at the community center where we talk about life, aging, and even the things we regret. And you know what? I have never felt more socially fulfilled. People fear that being single means being lonely. But let me tell you, being surrounded by the wrong people is lonelier than being alone. Now, every friendship I have is one I chose. Every gathering is one I enjoy. There's no pressure, no obligations, just good company. On my terms. So now, I ask you, if you could build your social life from scratch, who would you choose to surround yourself with? What kinds of conversations would you have? Tell me in the comments. Life after 55 isn't an ending, it's a new beginning, a time when you get to live on your own terms, free from compromise, obligation, and emotional weight. Whether it's choosing how to spend your time, shaping your home into a sanctuary, or surrounding yourself with people who bring you true joy, this is your moment to reclaim what makes you happy. So what does your ideal life look like? What's one thing you've rediscovered about yourself since embracing your independence? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and if this message resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because everyone deserves to know that the best years might just be ahead.